these images that you have been showing regarding your work through the archives lead us to this other question that, you know, we basically wanted to ask, you know, Gaëlle, Eliot, and Dot, regarding the role of language within the images.
I think what I find very interesting in Marcelo's practice is what you were saying, the combination of text and images, the fact that also, I think with archival images, what's interesting is that if somebody becomes interested in them, it requires some work and research and some digging. And it's kind of a treasure hunt. It can become a treasure hunt, you know, like what is it in this image that you find interesting? What is the event represented? Who took the photo? How was it circulated? What are the aesthetic standards that are applied to it? Was it meant to be published in a newspaper, in which case it's a bit different than if it's a personal album, like you were saying, Marcelo. It's like all the different purposes are interesting and add to the story. And like you said, Marcelo, I think I'm talking about treasure hunt because like you were saying, sometimes the events are not known. Sometimes the images are not accessible or were not accessible for so long. Sometimes, you know, like in the Black Star collection, we have 300,000 photographs. A lot of them are actually not known. A lot of them are actually anonymous. A lot of them were taken because Black Star was functioning as a, you know, a stock agency. And the idea was to have as many photos as they could. And within this group they needed to have generic images that could be used to pretty much anything, you know, an image that could have as many meanings as they needed. So there's a lot of different types of images in the archives, obviously. And I think in this case for Marcelo, for me to add that text and to have that series of images from the same time, showing similar events with specific context for each one of them, but still similar events like young people on the street protesting, basically. And then, you know, every history is different, every country is different, but having those texts kind of like help understanding the specific context for each and help revealing the maybe unknown events and help understanding those events a little bit better. And I do believe that emotions can work on multiple levels. And I think visually you can be moved, but you can also be moved by a slogan or a text or a portion of a text or a word. Or when I see the images from Paris, this is where I'm from. My parents were on the street in May 68. I have personal images of them on the street. I have personal stories. I've heard a lot about them. And when I see the words, they resonate with what I know and don't know, with my personal history, with the big history. So I do believe that combining both brings another layer. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, so much here. First of all, I just love the 68 work. And I've just finished reading a book by Bifo Berardi, who's an Italian philosopher. He was the founder of Radio Alice. You would know his work. Futurability. So it has yeah, exactamente. And so it's interesting that he is taking, in some way, in the last part, which is about possibility, he has a very bleak version, a very bleak view of the present. And at the beginning of the pandemic, he had a kind of utopic moment. I'm not sure it has sustained itself as we look at the reset. But he does talk a lot about possibilities, but he actually traces this back to 68. So and you know, and where there was this kind of other kind, he identifies it was the last moment of possibility of a kind of non-neoliberal world. But he's optimistic endlessly that there will be other ways, and what he calls the kinds of intellectual artists, workers of the world, will collectively think through this. Of course, I see you as very central to that project. And I'm also particularly interested in this idea, not of kind of, though, like there's, Gaëlle talks about the treasure hunt of the archive, and I think that's one side of it. The other side is actually your kind of, see, I think there must be another word for it. Like, I wouldn't call you an archivist. I would call you a, I don't know. I have to think of something. I have to think of the word in which you're actually, you're making a kind of meta-narrative. It's not even an archive anymore. It's actually a kind of political intervention. You're asking us to look at a moment in time and reimagine and rethink ourselves there. And as you say, it's for another generation. So I wanted to ask a question about the other side, which is, you know, there's the process of the looking and the collecting and the intervening and the coloring and the stories. Then there's the process of putting it in the gallery. And I read your text that's posted on Lala Gallery, where you talk about the relation of the screen and physical space. And I was really interested too that you were really kind of saying the screen reduces everything. And then there's still this very important place for the way in which we need to interact with that work, which goes back to an image that you showed also of the students in front of the photograph. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts about what this looks like now, like in relation to us all having been online in some way, and consuming most, I think, sheltering in place, our access to the larger world is not just through those kinds of, like, our access to history and the world is through this kind of screen. It's not even through those kind of archival photographs that you make so material through your kind of coloring. Like, what do you envision when these go up in New York? And when do they go up?
Well, let me say that the question is very relevant now, because I am discussing right now with David Company the layout of the show in New York.
Right.
Where we, incredibly, in this crazy year, I will have a physical exhibition in a museum that was closed for several years after I left Avenue of the Americas museum, and they moved downtown to the Bowery. They started with the first show, and that was closed by the pandemic, and this will be the reopening show. I mean, and the ICP has a long, let's say, political tradition of commitment with photography and of defending the rights of the photographers for their images. So all this discussion is now happening about if I will use or not images of the 2020 marches as opposed and in combination with images of 68. Only two images. I'm talking about only two images in Washington. The discussion is about these two images. One of them is the image that refers to what happened recently when this image of the Women's March in 2017 in New York was shown in an exhibition in the National Archives in Washington, and it was censored. The references to Trump were erased from the picture, and that was a big discussion in the Washington Post and all over. So I licensed the picture from Getty and just colored the pictures of the billboards that were censored. Only that. In this case, God Hates Trump was one of the things that was censored. And here, something about the pussy and something about, here you are, okay? God doesn't love Trump, this kind of thing. So it's only a very short signal of what was censored in that march that I am considering to put in connection with the 68 work. And then there is another image of the Visual Lives Matter marches we are considering. And the discussion is, how does the contemporary relate with the historic, and if they can be put together? So I've been thinking this morning about how they interact, the contemporary with the historic, and I believe that they do work well together. Let me show you a couple of 68 displays in which the experience of the exhibition happens. That is important because the personal experience of being there is not replaced by the screen. That is what I was that's what I was saying during my, I mean, this is, for instance, an installation in Brussels, Fire of Ideas. Okay, you see 40 images in a wall, all the text in the wall, all the people around reading and thinking and talking about their own experience of 68. 68 was a moment in which somehow culturally the world changed, and probably 2020 has a similar condition. All this movement around the world may eventually be the seed of changes that will come about race and about many other social issues that are at stake now in this discussion. I believe that is very important. What I say about the screen is that the screen cannot replace the personal experience of being there. It is impossible, because when you interact with this kind of setup, it's totally different personally. You stay there minutes. You have a connection that cannot be replaced by the screen. And the screen reduces everything to the same size. Every image becomes, in a way, the same, because they are all in the same size. They are all cropped down to the size of the screen. In a way, it's very difficult to identify the subtle differences and the color and the smell and the shape. That's why I, with many other people, believe that the screen is a transitory moment. It will remain, because we can have this conversation, which we couldn't have in Canada when I was in Toronto. I didn't even meet the magazine. I met you separately. Now we are having this conversation together. It is being recorded, being edited. Probably something will come up. That's great, but that doesn't replace the personal experience of being in front of the piece. This is something that is essential for me. It is the reason for which I do the work. The reason for which I do the work is to tell this story to these young people. They are not so young anymore. They are 20 years. This was 20 years ago. There's a new generation, and my daughter is there now. But now the class picture is there on a permanent display. It has become part of a permanent display of the institution to tell all the different generations that come what has happened in that school, how and what made 120 students of the school be killed. And it's their own school, and it's their own space. And that installation of the class picture in the school in a permanent way is more important than any Zoom experience for me, because I cannot reach all these children, all these students, all these young teenagers in any other direct way as that. And that was the purpose of the work. And it is being performed there. Not now, because even the school is closed, but that will come back. And that is the kind of reference I make to the difficulties that the screen has to replace the personal experience.
Thank you for inviting me to come and see some of what you've been working on. And I'll just mention one thought that I had as you were showing us some of your 1968 work. And I think what I appreciate about your additions, your language and your color that you've added to it, is that it really, it visually gives us a key that we're no longer looking at something from 68, right? This is not an archival image in the sense that we are to take it as fact and understand it in 1968. It's something that we're to look at in 2020 and reflect on on its augmentation to say something about our present, to say something about our future. And so I think that color and that text is that icon that establishes that break from what actually happened in 68 and that you're talking about the present. And so I wonder if you've thought about how that will work if you take an image that's really in the present moment, let's say of some of the Black Lives Matter marches or anything from 2020. It's a very different sort of image, right? It's something we're living now, not something we're reflecting on. And so your own accentuation or manipulation of an image in the present feels very different conceptually than your work with something, say, from 68. And you know, of course, I haven't got my head around quite how that will play out, but I do think there is care in how those two things are dealt with, you know?
Yes, I believe that the archival images of 68 are definitely talking about today. I agree with that. They are talking about today. And they are talking about today to a generation of people that are the same age as the ones that marched in 68 and that have similar challenges in terms of producing change in society. And something is like getting old, as the politicians in the 60s. Something is getting no longer valid as it happened then. So many changes happened after 68 in sexual conduct and so many other areas of life, in political participation of young people, in social movements. Everything changed. And I was very much affected. In music, when I saw last week, 80th anniversary of Ringo Starr on a YouTube, he was showing his 64 images of his travel with the Beatles to the US and all these bathroom for women, men, and colored people. That was there already in 64. That was happening then, so recently, unbelievable. And I saw it there. I mean, Ringo was showing what he lived when he went to the US and comparing it with today. This is still valid. He said, peace and love, peace and love. Like the same thing. This was what I did with contemporary images on the situation of migration in the Mediterranean in 16. I licensed contemporary images from the EFE agency and used them with the intervention. This is like a Baroque painting. It could be, I mean, the image has no time. I mean, this has happened always. People's moving because of war, and this happens to be a contemporary image, but it tells, I mean, this person could be in a Baroque painting. So I think that depending and being careful, images can be contemporary images can be incorporated into an art project, but it's more delicate. You have to certainly talk with a photographer, share the experience, be very subtle in the way in which the written intervention happens or no intervention. But I still believe that they are part of a language I use, and that in contraposition and conversation with the historic archives, they can present an interesting tension to think and what was changed and what remains, how the people in the streets were then and how they are now, what they were asking, what they are asking today. I mean, and therefore my idea is that the authorship of the picture is not the central thing. I recognize its importance, I pay for the rights, I put the name of the author, but the essential thing is the narration, what you want to tell. Whatever you use to do that, text, images, music, performance, everything is good, is valid, is positive. There's no limit in the use of media to deliver a message. And that's what brings me back to the idea of language, how today language is in a way visual and textual at the same time. And the visual part of it will only grow with time as visual communications become central and as people send each other more images than text. Images will have more and more presence in the communication, and they will be essential for younger people to pay attention to any discourse. Therefore, the change of language as a consequence of the massive eruption of images is something we have to think about and we have to work with. We as professionals in art, in communication, in research. For instance, this seminar I participated at Princeton about the itinerant language of photography for 4 years that were organized by Eduardo Cadava. It wasn't organized by a photography department. It wasn't organized by an art department. It was organized by the language department of Princeton. The language department of Princeton was worried to know and interested to know how images were changing their body of research, their area of research. Language is changing. And we are protagonists of that change. How much we can use it in favor of delivering a message? How far can we be? How can we move? Can we go? That's part of another exercise I've been working on in the last 10 years, which are the visual correspondences, conversations that are entirely made with images. How far can we go with a purely visual conversation? If you have the time, I would very much love to show you the last visual conversation I had during the pandemic with a Polish photographer based in Cardiff called Michal Iwanowski. How far can we go with it? How long can we communicate with each other with visual language that is so open? It hasn't got a dictionary. It opens up the reaction in a different way. It is somehow an attempt to deal with the issue that if this change keeps on going, in a certain moment, we would just only send images, only speak with images. That won't happen, but this is a classic mathematical way of demonstrating a theorem by the absurd. If we go it to infinite, where will we get? And that is somehow the question. I am doing that one with Joan Foncuberta today also now. It's very interesting. I mean, every conversation is a way of knowing the other person in a totally different way than any other conversation. It's a visual contact. And this is an area of research. It's a different area of research, but it comes back to the issue of language. Is visual language able to deliver all what it will be asked for? Or how can we deal with that? That is a question. I mean, as usually art doesn't give the answers, but at least it presents the problem as a visual problem.
For me, that's a fascinating project. I don't think it's resolved. I don't think it needs to be resolved. I don't think it will be resolved. I don't know if, you'll continue, but I think this idea of visual correspondence for me is kind of very interesting. And as a curator, to have two artists communicating visually, I'm really looking forward to seeing more about this work and seeing how it will evolve. And I think this is really interesting for me.
But what I wanted to ask Marcelo is the visual correspondence. When you send the photograph, do you send a story with it, or does the other person ask about a story? Because you say, oh, this is the butterfly, him going to see his mother in Poland, and I recognize, of course, some of your images.
We say nothing. We say nothing. I knew that was his mother later. I knew that was his mother because we had another, let's say, Zoom conference with David Drake from Cardiff, and we discussed about correspondence, and then he told me it's my mother. But I didn't know. We don't say anything. We just send the images.
The images back and forth.
Yeah.
And how do you know when it's over?
Well, there is a minimum, let's say, size of the conversation for it to make sense and come together in a readable way, which is like 30 images, 15 each. Okay. In this moment, you are ready to finish when the right image arrives.
Okay.
Then you are ready. I mean, the conversation has moved sufficiently as to reach a point when it can finish. And then that happens when the right image is sent, generally not by me, but by the other one, because if I start, I mean, who starts doesn't finish. So that's basically it. The finish, the end image comes after 30 when there is an image that is a good conclusion. I will send you, I don't probably have time now to show you more, but I can send you a few more that I've been having lately with Joan Foncuberta and with other artists, and how the presence of the pandemic is, or the lockdown is in the images showing up.
Yeah.
Interesting how the images show what is happening. Although we not only use images we take in the moment, we call fresh fish the image we take for the correspondence, and frozen fish the one comes from the file, which also is, sometimes you see an image and it immediately drives you to an image of yours you remember that you might have taken 20 years ago, but that's the picture you want. So it's an exercise of the archive and of the visual exercise of visual culture and of visual, let's say, practice. It's a very dynamic way of thinking of images. And yeah. And
do you have a time to respond in the game?
I'm sorry?
Do you have a time to respond back in the game?
It changes a lot. It changes a lot from each person. Yeah. Sometimes it's very fast, as I had with my friend in Lisbon. Sometimes it takes years, a couple of years.
I also think it's very interesting to think about the visual correspondences that start long before Instagram. But, you know, Instagram is a kind of public, privatized public, whereas what you're doing in the visual correspondences is so much about the intimacy of storytelling. And so, which sort of makes me think too back to the 68 photographs and the degree to which they produce an intimacy of exchange for the viewer, which isn't possible.
It's very intimate.
Very intimate. I hadn't thought about the intimacy part, but the visual correspondences made me kind of think about that. And also just, you know, when I said at the beginning, you know, in some way you're a visual storyteller. Obviously you're a photographer and artist, but I don't think you're an archivist. I think you use the archive.
No, I use the archive. I used to live from the archive because, as you know, I had a picture agency for 30 years. So I have been a professional of the archive in a way.
We're thinking through the kind of primacy of the visual image. I was thinking about, I read a short novel a couple nights ago called Moon of the Crusted Snow. It's by an young indigenous writer. And it really is about storytelling. I mean, there's a lot of visual, of course, evocations in it, but and I was thinking about kind of the question of indigeneity in Canada and the primacy of storytelling. And in a way, you know, you speak to the primacy of the visual image, but actually behind that, I think that what your work is also really about a primacy of storytelling. The image is I actually wrote it down. I said, like, the image is almost like like Bart. It's a punch of narration. It's like what provokes this kind of intimacy, or this people in a gallery looking at a thing from 68 and then wanting to have a conversation about it. And I was really fascinated when Gaëlle said, well, her parents were there. It would be really wonderful to have Gaëlle and her parents and you have a conversation about those photographs.
Well, yes. The conversation generated by art, the questions generated for a conversation by art are essential. In fact, the most important, let's say, art project that I ever did, which is the memorial in Buenos Aires, the Parque de la Memoria, with all the sculptures and all the names of the victims of the dictatorship, is the perfect place for a father to tell his son what happened in that time. I mean, it generates the circumstances, nature, the names, the art, the river. That's the moment to talk about it, relaxed in a different way, that you wouldn't have a chance to do neither at home or with a book. You live it, you're in the middle of it. You're experiencing the art, you're experiencing the landscape, the river as a symbol of people being thrown there and of our name as Rio Platenses. Everything comes together. And that's a moment of, let's say, an epiphany for a father or for a family or for a son of a victim or for anybody else, a school that comes to visit, to talk about it with a very different, let's say, circumstance, emotional situation. And that's where you learn. That's when your emotion enables you to really understand. The degree of understanding that happens in those circumstances has a different quality. And that's what I'm always after, trying to reach the moment in which you can generate with a work, with a project, circumstances to learn from experience in a different way, more open, more emotional. And that's where I think the key is.
And your work, what also I think is interesting about it is that when we think of 68, the way, I was young, very young, too young. And so I always think of 68 as this utopic moment I never got to live through. And it's often positioned as quite utopic or a failed utopia. But in some way, what you're doing with those photographs is you're actually identifying within that utopia a kind of moment of trauma. And it's actually the moment of trauma that coloring does, that opens up the conversation. Because if it was just utopic, there'd be no entry point for another generation. It would just be like this history that, oh yeah, that all happened. Look, it was 68. It failed. It's over. Old people talk about it as if it's wonderful. What has it got to do with us? So there's something there about the trajectory of your work all the way through. And trauma, again, is maybe not the right word, but there's something, and the reason I say that is when you talk about the Parque de Memoria, in that moment, when is the moment to tell the story? And how do you create the container to tell the story? So these photographs of 68 in some way are also containers for stories to be told to a generation, but also among another generation. So I think that doubling is very interesting as well. It'll be very interesting to see.
When you quote Bifo saying the relationship there is between 68 and today, there is something about art that sometimes it feels the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, and somehow anticipates a bit what will happen. What Bifo talks about, the connection between 68 and 2020, which certainly there is because of the depth of what is at stake.
Yeah.
And about what we inevitably know, that all this worldwide movement will generate some kind of change because it will continue and it is not the end of it. And there is a changing quality of conscience of number of people in our society, I believe, as 68. It's not immediate, it's not obvious, but it is somehow part of the reality. The connection of 68, of this work now, with what is happening now, happens to be very fortunate because, in fact, when I started this, it was because of Ayotzinapa, which is now in the papers today again. Ayotzinapa, the massacre and the kidnapping of the 43 students in Mexico. That's what led me to...
Right, because they found some of them, identified some of the DNA.
No, they identified. An Argentinian forensic group, Equipo Argentino de Antropología Forense, which you probably know, identified the remains of one of the 43 in a place that is different to the place that the authorities had said that they were burned in. So there is a whole new line of investigation after this finding, which was released 2 days ago. It's in the press of El País today in Madrid. But what led me to 68 was these children were marching to remember the 68 Tlatelolco massacre. They were hiring a bus to go to Mexico to participate in the Tlatelolco March, which happens every 2nd of October. the 2nd of October of 68, there was this killing of 250 or more or less students in the Square of the Three Cultures in Mexico City, in the University Square. And when I realized that they were going to march for Tlatelolco, to remember Tlatelolco, I wrote in a picture of 68 of the Tlatelolco events before the massacre, in the marches that were leading towards that outcome, that if Tlatelolco would have been judged, Ayotzinapa wouldn't have happened. That's what I wrote in that first 68 intervention I made. 214 drove me to 68 because I understood that if Ayotzinapa happened, it was because Tlatelolco hadn't been judged. And that's how it all started. Then I landed in 68 and started looking around and started working on the 68. But it was the present that led me to that past, and the past that comes back to this present. And this dynamic of the relationship between 68 and 14 with Ayotzinapa, or 68 with 20 with George Floyd, is a very interesting dynamic in terms of the pass of time and how art can interact and deal with it in a way.